Not only was it the enslaved blacks who were tormented by the whites, but it was also the free blacks who the whites couldn't wait to keep in their place at the bottom of the pit. And so we're dealing right now with the settings of 1800s America, where in much of the society, primarily in the South, but also in the North, there were people puffing on packs of white supremacy, and they were acting extremely aggressive and uncivilized towards those of the rich brown complexion. And so some of this history is what we're going to deal with in this video. And for us to do so, we're going to go into the book called Race in North America by Dr. Audrey Smedley. So let's go in here and turn to page 205, where she writes this. The free Negro contradicted the white image of those who by their very racial definition were not entitled to freedom. If slavery was the natural and normal condition of Africans, and they were happiest and freest when subordinate to and in the care of whites, then free Negroes were an abomination, a threat to the social system and a danger to themselves. In both North and South, the lives of free blacks in the late 18th and 19th centuries were hemmed in by numerous and onerous restrictions. Their mobility was limited. They could not vote or hold public office in most states. They could not own or bear arms, and they could not testify against a white man. And which tool did they use to create this restriction? The handy-dandy tool of the law, which limited the Negroes' rights to vote, hold public office, bear arms, and testify against any of those known as white people. Here we go. They had no right of assembly, except in churches, were forced to observe curfews, and often had to carry certificates confirming their free status. And why were they not allowed to assemble anywhere else other than the church? If Jesus and the Bible had all of this grand power, why would they allow them to assemble in the church and not other places? That's because the church was another tool used by the white elites. They used this tool to instill submissiveness and docility in the Negroes. Understand? Now, the Bible in itself, it doesn't yield any power whatsoever. And that's because it's just paper with words in it. The power comes from the interpretation of the words, and also how the interpretation is applied to one's life and circumstance. Understand this clearly. And so we've already seen in Reverend Charles Colcott Jones's 1842 book, The Religious Instruction of the Negroes, that the most simplistic interpretations of the Bible were given to the Negroes. And that's because they were said to be incapable of understanding the deeper doctrines. And on top of that, they were to be instructed in such a way to make them more submissive slaves for their masters, right? This is one of the reasons that they were allowed to assemble in the church, because the church for blacks, it was not seen as a real threat to the slave institution. So on top of not being able to assemble except in the churches, the blacks had curfews, and they also had to carry certificates to prove that they were free people, right? Now let's get some more. In both North and South, the free Negro was perceived as lazy and improvident. Improvident means lacking the ability of foresight or long-term planning, and being very wasteful in resources and in time, with minimal consideration for the future. So Dr. Smedley says that Negroes in the North and the South were perceived as lazy and improvident. And here's what else. Prone to crime and general depravity, and unworthy of white respect, fair play, or justice. Prone to crime means that it's in their nature to break the law. It's like they come out of the womb ready to commit criminal activities as they grow up. This is dealing with the inherency of traits, which we've been discussing in earlier videos. And on top of that, they were said to be unworthy of white respect or any justice in the court system. Here we go. Simultaneously, they were also being displaced from skilled jobs in favor of white workers. The cultural behavior prescribed by an ideology of inequality and exclusiveness meant that everywhere the rank of white was given precedence. She said the cultural behavior prescribed by an ideology of inequality, which means that once the ideas of inequality rooted in the white mind, those ideas began altering their behavior and influencing their actions. Now, when there are ideologies believed by people who behave in certain ways based on those beliefs, then you get aspects of culture. And one aspect of white culture at this time was that everywhere the rank of white was given precedence. Now let's keep reading. Even where there were no strict laws of segregation,
the black presence was downgraded. In religion, recreation, and economic and social life, blacks and Indians could be present only as subordinates, unseen and ignored.
That's part of reinforcing the low racial status of blacks and Indians, which is part of the race system.
Only low-status occupations were open to low-ranked races. It was inconceivable that such persons could have any role to play in public life.
We discussed a bit of this in the last video, how it was utterly unimaginable to see a person with brown skin as president, governor, or any other important role in society, right? It just wasn't imaginable. And it just goes to show just how much society has shifted in the past couple centuries, and how the consciousness of society is never stagnant, but instead is always changing. Understand?
For all blacks, slave and free, repeated daily humiliations and unrestrained cruelties translated into conventional behavior and were perpetuated in each new generation.
These are those ideas and behaviors that keep finding homes for themselves in new human vehicles. They survive by propagating themselves from generation to generation, from parent to child, which is why she writes that those acts towards blacks became conventional or widely accepted behavior and were perpetuated in each new generation, which each new generation needed to be indoctrinated actively and passively about the treatment of blacks before they could act out certain cruelties against them. Understand? They had to have certain ideas rooted in their mind before they were able to do so. And if they were never taught those ideas by their parents, the schools, and through their regular observation of society, then the chances are they would have never behaved that way towards them, right? Think about that, and let's keep reading.
It takes little imagination to conjure up the proliferation of demeaning treatment targeted at the Negro and the consequent institutionalization of such practices. A variety of customs were originated and associated with the debasement of blacks.
These are the rituals within the society that symbolically represent the idea of whites being at the top and blacks being at the bottom. And like I've said before, the entire society was set up in such a way to constantly reinforce this idea, from the names black and white to what Dr. Smedley is about to explain next.
Acts of physical and psychological brutality were carried out with impunity.
The whites could inflict extreme violence against the blacks and then legally get away with doing so. And what type of image do you think this impressed on the mind of society at that time? One of the images is that those who they called blacks had less valuable lives. And many of the blacks themselves, they went on to internalize this message and really believe in that reality, right? And this constant ritual of reinforcing the idea of blacks at the bottom and blacks being worthless, this had a tremendous effect upon the psychological development of the enslaved and also the free Negroes. And that's one of the reasons why getting away from the black identity is so crucial for entering the free world, because it's loaded with a tremendous amount of emotional trauma, right? But let's keep reading.
There should be no doubt that the degradation, dehumanization, and demeaning aspects of the slave relationship elicited from many blacks behavioral syndromes of abject subordination.
There should be no doubt that the way blacks were treated in slavery influenced many of them to behave in an extremely submissive manner towards white people and be humiliated in the process as well. This is what she's talking about right here. And one thing that we have to understand is that they had to behave this way, right? This was a survival mechanism, because showing signs of dominance, confidence, autonomy, anything of that sort could lead to the whites acting extremely violent, like we just talked about, right? So the blacks had to pivot and adjust to the environment by acting extremely submissive or abject subordination, right? Here we go.
On many plantations, slaves were broken in spirit. They were constantly fearful of the unmitigated power of their owners and other whites over them.
Uh-oh, now watch this.
Lower-class whites who would never own slaves debased and humiliated both slaves and free blacks, if for no other reason than to demonstrate their own superiority and power to do so.
The backwood whites, who were poor, had minimal skills, and were uneducated in many areas, could always make themselves feel better by simply knowing that they were above all those called black people. The poor whites, you got to understand, they puffed on some of the strongest packs of white supremacy, and they could get high at any time. Anytime they interacted with a Negro, they could get high. They could be down and out, struggling in their normal life, but as soon as they got around blacks, they got high as a kite, right? High to the point where they felt themselves to be on par with the white elite, right? That's how high they got. And that's how white supremacy worked, as a psychological tool to get on board the poor whites who never owned slaves. Understand? And let's keep reading.
The essence of racial inequality was distilled in the shuffling and subordinate behavior of blacks vis-a-vis whites, the lowering of the eyes, the avoidance behavior in public, the jocular acceptance of insult and humiliation, and the deference always to white opinion.
This is part of the submissive behavior we discussed a bit earlier, and it was reinforced in multiple ways, one of them being the lowering of the eyes, where the blacks could not look the whites directly in the eyes or stare at them for any extended period, because this could symbolize a challenge or being on the same level as the whites, which was a no-go at that time. The avoidance behavior deals with minimizing attention and interactions in public. The jocular acceptance of insults and humility is making light of being mistreated and also laughing off insults, right? And the last that she says is deference always to white opinion, which is dealing with the blacks being in agreement to white opinion, or being submissive to the views of the whites, or conforming to the opinion of the whites, even if those views were harmful or dismissive. And so this is how the blacks had to get down. They had to pivot like this in this extreme white supremacy environment, because it looked for any reason to punish them. So these were appropriate survival tactics for that time and place.
Black subservience and control by whites was important, from the white point of view, not only to prevent riots and rebellions, but also to prevent race mixture and the subversion of white racial purity, a notion gaining currency with the ascendancy of racial Anglo-Saxonism. The overarching vision of America for most whites became that of white advancement, privilege, and homogeneity, with inferior races kept at a distance in a state of permanent subordination. To this end, throughout the 19th century, race hatred, fear, and contempt increased as commonplace sentiments. Numerous physical attacks on blacks, even in northern cities, attested to the intensity of race hatred instigated by those whites who felt threatened or insecure.
So we can see that even the whites in the non-slaveholding states became violent. And violence is one of the core actions that the white supremacy ideology promotes. And it does that because it preaches an extremist doctrine, which convinces people with certain physical features that they're actually better than other humans based on those physical features alone, which is wild, but this is what the ideology promotes. And when that idea is challenged or threatened in any way, it incites violence by those who are actually insecure beneath the surface, right? And also, this violence was the tool to reinforce the racial rankings and to maintain social order. And so the whites were using this as a means to keep alive the consciousness of white supremacy, right? Let's get some more.
All of the precursors of Jim Crow laws, enacted toward the end of the century, were already in place in the sense that white manipulation and control of blacks was an everyday, ongoing affair, fulfilling the explicit mandate to keep the Negro in his decreed place. The culture of race placement required embroidering a social tapestry replete with small acts and nuances that formalized and entrenched gross inequality.
She's saying that the culture of race placement, or assigning roles and statuses to this concept called race, required embroidering a social tapestry, or knitting the fabric of society, with these little acts and rituals that reflected and symbolized inequality. Little things like blacks getting off the sidewalk when the whites passed by, or the blacks not speaking to the whites until they're addressed, the lowering of the eyes, so on and so forth. These little acts, all woven together, is what created the larger fabric of an unequal society. This is what Dr. Smedley is referring to in this sentence here. Here we go.
In a society where personal acts of brutality and violence are often touted as bravery or courage, or are tolerated as human nature, unmitigated power becomes a dangerous instrument. Power corrupts, as Lord Acton observed so astutely, and absolute power is so bloating to the psyche that men and women who acquire it lose all rational perceptions and connections to reality. We saw in the 20th century many examples of tyrants and despots around the world who have aggrandized excessive personal power and wealth and become addicted to its lure. There is no redemption from the corrosive consequences of absolute power. It is an addiction so complete that people's minds become warped. They can no longer comprehend limits of any nature, and too often exceed to extremes of brutality, avarice, and lust.
Which is what happened to many of the whites, and especially the white elites.
They cannot relinquish the exaggerated levels of power and privilege, or even think rationally enough to try. This is the sickness of excessive and absolute power. This sickness and the seductive nature of white power characterized the social reality of white-black relations in the 19th century. In many areas of the South, this situation continued throughout the 20th century. Some whites reveled in their power over blacks.
Meaning some whites thoroughly enjoyed having power over the blacks. Not just a passive enjoyment, but an active enjoyment of feeling a sense of superiority over these people. And not even simply just feeling it, but also acting upon that feeling by bullying, being oppressive, and also committing extreme acts of violence.
It shored them up, gave them a feeling of mastery and grandness, and even seduced some into unspeakable acts of cruelty and sadism. Every white person, slave owner or not, could experience the lofty feeling not only of being better than any Negro, but of having his power over blacks sanctioned by society.
Every white person, no matter if they were a slave owner or not, could get high off of white supremacy. They could sit down together by the fire and talk about how unintelligent the Negro was, or how God blessed them to have the light skin, or how they must be the chosen people to bring civilization to humanity, right? And all these types of things. Then at the end of the discussion, they would have puffed on at least 2 packs of freshly dried white supremacy, right? And they could be high off of that for the remainder of the week, right? But understand that these packs are nowhere near as strong today because the potency is running out. And just like everything else that rises up, it must fall and come down, right? Because rhythm compensates. The Kabbalion. Now let's keep reading.
When Jefferson spoke of the depravity that whites derived from such power and transmitted unwittingly to their children, the
unremitting despotism,
the
given loose to his worst of passions,
and the education in the
exercise in tyranny,
he revealed the malignancy of such raw, insensate power. Jefferson was not a stranger to the brutalizing and odious effects of absolute power in the slave situation. The daily exercise of white personal power over black individuals had become a cherished aspect of Southern culture. To abrogate it by emancipating the slaves was tantamount to giving up the Southern way of life, as the North was so frequently reminded during and after the Civil War. Wealthy plantation owners even convinced poor whites, who had never owned slaves, that they shared in this power relationship over blacks. Indeed, they enlisted poor whites in the pro-slavery cause. The Southern concept of honor was predicated on maintaining the system. This was one issue that could and did bind together all whites. It became a cause that transcended their own cultural and class differences and provides clear historical evidence of the distinctiveness of the race domain and its priority over class.
Theodore Allen argues this same point in his book, The Invention of the White Race, where he discusses how the white elites lured the poor whites into the race ideology and basically manipulated them to accept the idea of race over economic class interest. And this was one of the ways that the white elites were able to neutralize the poor whites, right? And recruit them to be pawns in their game in the racial worldview, right? So that's it on that. But what we've seen here in this commentary is how ideologies influence the actions of their holders, and how the extremist ideology of white supremacy moved many whites to become violent and oppressive towards other humans. And for many of the whites, they lost touch of what it means or what it meant to be human at that time. And many of them still struggle today with this idea that humanity is not centered around them, right? But over time, I suspect that many of them will learn to escape from this vast pit that was dug by many of their distant ancestors, right? And so with that being said, hopefully you've found something valuable in this commentary. I want to thank you right now for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.